Hello, everyone. Happy Saturday. Happy Saturday. Oh my goodness, I am super duper excited to be having this discussion today because I had made a previous video and I realized that I had been leaving some stuff out. So I am starting over, basically, to have a new and hopefully enlightening discussion about this. And as you can see, the title of this particular presentation is Why Are Black Americans Not Acknowledging Their Aboriginal Roots? Now, many of us acknowledge our roots who know our ancestry and we've done our extensive genealogy, but some of us are not acknowledging it properly, I should say, because we're still calling ourselves Black. We're still calling ourselves African American. Like we're calling ourselves monikers that aren't necessarily representative of our culture and our identity. Now, I know many people will say, well, Black is an identity, African American is an identity. And I'm going to contradict that because I want to really get specific here. Right. And I'm going to share with you guys many things that are important for us to consider as we move forward. So as we talk about this, I want to share with you guys the table of contents, what we're going to talk about in the discussion today. We're going to talk about, of course, affirming your Indigenous status. We're going to talk about the out of Africa theory. We're going to talk about the transatlantic slave trade by the numbers. We're also going to do a bit of an infant mortality rate analysis, which is connected to the transatlantic slave trade. And I'm also going to share with you some final thoughts for you to consider. Now, keep in mind, every time I do these presentations with you guys, there are resources that are in the description for you to do your own research and for you, quite frankly, to see that we at the American Aboriginals have done our research so that we can get less pushback. Sometimes we still get it, but you know how it is. So we're going to dive right into affirming your Indigenous status. And there's certain things I want to say. And remember, with this being, probably almost an hour discussion, there are going to be some things I don't get to. Because I can be literally doing various videos on just this one topic. But I want to say something about the Indigenous and the quote unquote Native American. I want to say this, right? Just like all quote unquote Black people don't look alike, neither do all Native American tribes don't look alike. And the reason why I say this is because we have traditionally been marketed to see one type of Native American, which has the longer, straight hair or is usually lighter than us. So, but as we know, over time, that is just not true. And originally, when you look in the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, the term American originally applied to the Aboriginals or the copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, right? So keep that in mind as we have this discussion, because people, of course, are going to look different with each generation. But I really want to tell you guys and show you that we all don't look alike. Just because you see one type of Indigenous person marketed to you, that does not mean that that is all of us. Okay. So one of the things I want to say, and I want to stress this particularly for my my fellow quote unquote Black Americans, that we are the descendant of the ancient and original peoples who had dark complexions. And that is who we are descended from. So therefore, you are Indigenous / Aboriginal to this planet. Point blank. I don't care who they show or who they put in front of us. We are the descendant of the original peoples. My skin color says it. I don't even need to make a statement about it. But because there's been all this political intrigue and positioning and power grabbing in this country in particular, there's been, how can I say, people have lost their memories and their minds because they tend to forget that they are descended from dark people, right? And for me to even begin to talk about someone preceding that is a pointless conversation. So that is why we say the American Aboriginals, right? It's even deeper than Indigenous, because when you are from the original, there's not much more to say after that. It really isn't. So people will come here and make statements, oh, you're not the original peoples, you're not the First Nations. I'm like, no, 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 no. We are. We are the First Nations because we birthed everybody, right? And I'm going to show you guys some evidence to that too, if you don't know and you haven't been paying attention. So, but one of the first things I want to do is in this affirmation is in 2007, the United Nations adopted a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And this declaration didn't just apply to the Indigenous people of America, but to the Indigenous all over the world, right? So it's like a 30-page document. It's pretty detailed. It goes into a lot of great things that we need to be affirming for ourselves. I've included the link in the description so that you guys can read it. And again, like I said, you are the descendant of the original peoples, so therefore you are Indigenous, right? So, but I also want to say this too, and I know that, the slave trade has been, talked about to ad nauseum in various capacities. And I want to just first say, first of all, the quote unquote African slave who was shipped to the original 13 colonies did at some point intermix with many different tribes. Let's just keep that real. So yes, you have the Aboriginals of the land, and then you, yes, did have the Africans who were shipped here, right? And again, the 2,000 plus tribes were various skin tones, ranging from dark to brown to swarthy to light. So this is where I feel so much confusion comes regarding identity, because people look at themselves in the mirror, particularly if they're quote unquote Black, and they say, well, I'm African. But no, that's not true. Unless you've done your genealogy, you just keep making that assumption about yourself, because the quote unquote tribes were very, very diverse, as I showed you from the very beginning. And when you look in this book, the Book of the Indians, you see there are literally hundreds of tribes, hundreds, right? Many of them are no longer here with us because of war and colonization and a whole bunch of other reasons. But I really want people to be very mindful that when you look at your skin color, don't automatically default and say, oh, I'm African. And yes, you can say that we all came out of Africa, but I'm going to talk about that too later on. And I'm going to debunk that theory a bit as well. So again, when you look in your family tree, you're going to see the Aboriginal or the dark Indian. You're going to see the pale skin Indian. You're going to see the dark or brown African. You're going to see the swarthy European. You're going to see the pale skin European. So absolutely, you're going to see all these people in your family tree. There's no doubt about it. But then I go back and I say, what dominates in your tree? What is the dominant coloring? What is the dominant, if you will, landscape of your family, your immediate family, right? So I just had to address that. But I just want to affirm as well that you're going to see different complexions in your tree. And those complexions are not necessarily because a European had a child with your grandmother. I'm just putting that out there. I'm keeping it 100. So, but I also wanted to show you guys some imagery too, some things that we don't always see in, popular culture. Now, this particular painting was what my research says is that we don't know who the original artist was, but the publisher of these particular paintings was a John Fairburn, and this particular series of paintings was called An Emblem of America. And this particular one is found in the British Museum. Now, this print comes from a group that also includes, Europe and Asia, representations of Europe and Asia. But as you can see, It says an emblem of America. And this is, of course, how artists depicted what they saw at that time. Okay. We also have another image of America. And you see how dark this man is? It's deep, isn't it? Deep, deep, deep. Now, of course, there's another emblem of America with a female figure representing Colombia. She's pointing to a portrait of, the people who were quite significant in, quote unquote, establishing the colonies, like Sir Walter Raleigh, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams. And plus there's a man in the picture whose name is illegible. But as you can see, there's also dark-skinned Aboriginals next to her. You see how that goes? And I know there's a lot of symbolism in this particular painting, but I won't go into that right now, but just to show you guys some things. Now, check this out. Now, here's an emblem of Africa. You see what's interesting about it is that the similarities between the Americans and the Africans were very similar. So yes, I am not here to discount any of my African cousins or to say that they're not important or to say that they're not my tree, because they are, right? But I also wanted you guys to see that the representation for Africa sometimes looks really, really similar to the representations of America, at least in terms of this particular series of paintings. So why are we not on the same page about this? Why are some of us still in various camps? Why are some of us saying, well, I'm African American. Well, I'm Black and I'm proud. Well, I'm Aboriginal. I'm an American Indian. Why are we not on the same page? And I'm going to tell you why in a minute. Okay. First of all, and I know this, I don't want to belittle our our educational system in this country, but currently the U.S. ranks 125 out of 194 countries in literacy. That's bad. For all the iPhones we have, all the laptops, all the access to books, we still cannot read above a 6th grade level, right? So what that also tells me is that we're not also comprehending what we read, because part of literacy means you have to also have comprehension. So if we're not in these books, we're not reading, that means we also are not getting a solid and well-rounded education, because education is not just in a classroom. But in terms of just testing, Americans are not doing really well in terms of literacy. So that's part of the reason why we're not on the same page, because our education sucks. And we are failing miserably. We're failing our children miserably, right? So the other reason why we're not on the same page is that most of us are not doing diligent research. What we do here at the American Aboriginals is we read. We research. And there is not, the information that we glean is not coming from one book or one source, not even from 5 sources. Sometimes I am reading, like, I'm going through 10 books a day. Not necessarily meaning I'm reading 10 books a day, but I'm accessing 10 books a day, looking at various things, reading various passages. Yes, and then, yes, reading a whole book. So this research is not just coming from a place of limited education. It's coming from a place of constant education. So that also means that we have to be up to date. And so when I have discussions with people about these things, they are basing their historical knowledge on old data, i.e. Christopher Columbus. Okay, by now we all know that Christopher Columbus did not discover America. We all know that now, right? But there are many people who had told you that before, and nobody listened to them. Nobody had listened to them, but there are scholars who said, no, he didn't. But because the establishment hadn't said it, nobody said, oh, okay, maybe he didn't. So that's part of the reason why we're all here, is because if you're not in these books every day, you're going to be behind. And I'm not expecting everybody to be a scholar, to be a PhD, because I don't have a PhD. But I'm in these books and I'm reading and I'm educating myself every day. So if you're not doing that, you're behind. Always. And I don't care how many news articles you read, those are just glossing the surface, right? And here's a big, big, big one. The people who I argue with the most have not done their genealogy. Not really. They know their grandmothers, their great-grandparents. They may have gone back 3 or 4 generations. But many of us need to go even deeper than that. So when you don't know who you are and you don't know who your people are, you're walking around here just repeating stuff. You're trying to glean from articles and some books and trying to crunch it all together. No one can tell me anything about my family. No one can tell me anything about who I am because I do my genealogy every day. Every day. At this point in time on Ancestry, I probably have about 5,000 family members in my tree, and I'm not even scratching the surface. That's how diligent I've been. 5,000 people is a lot of people, but hey, we'll get to it, right? So you cannot argue with people who've done their genealogy because they will tell you. They also are listening to their elders and not discounting what their elders tell them, right? Some people will say, oh, well, I did my DNA. Well, okay, that's fine. But I'm going to talk about that in another video. And there's some resources I'm going to be sharing with you guys. It's also in the description so that you guys can look at how those commercial kits that you get from these ancestry sites they only give you part of the picture. Yeah. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole nother chat and discussion. So, but overall, why we're not on the same page is this. We have not only been colonized, but, our people were murdered and sold. And that meant that a lot of the oral history was basically disrupted because we were just sold, murdered, women and children. Of course, it was horrible. So that is going to affect the information that you glean from your family. The other thing is that the colonizer also rewrote and inserted themselves in history. So a part of it is that you have been erased, not just physically, but also on paper. So there's a part of it there where you just don't know because people have been, co-opting you. And remember, it was also illegal for you to read and write for a time. It was illegal for you to read and write. Then they made it illegal for you to preserve your own heritage, right? So you couldn't preserve your own heritage. You couldn't read and write. And so this affected your future generations. So now they're walking around completely in the dark. And then by the time they allowed you to read and write, they re-educated you and indoctrinated the children. So that is why we're not on the same page, in a nutshell. So a lot of what we're doing at the American Aboriginals, and my fellow colleagues who are also doing this, are trying to reverse the damage. We're trying to reverse the damage by getting as much information as we possibly can. And trying to, quite frankly, get people to just go ahead and just do the work of doing their genealogy, which is a great start, right? So, in a nutshell, not only were our lands colonized, but so were our minds. And there's a lot of reversing that needs to happen there. Because once somebody basically re-educates you, and those generations are re-educated, and then those generations are re-educated, you really do start learning a whole nother narrative about yourself that was never really you to begin with. It feels like it's you. It just sounds so amazing, but it's not you. It's not often cases. So, but I want to get into this out of Africa theory, right? Because part of what we've also been dealing with is the Africa paradigm, is what I call it. And again, I'm not here to erase my people. I'm not going to do that. What I really want to do is expand the narrative about who we are. Now, one of the first things I want to say quickly is I want us to also start remembering our Aboriginal roots and that Africa was renamed. by the Romans and Greeks in the late 17th century. And yes, Africa has been called many things by the people, and depending on which region you're in. But one of the names I like is Al-Kubalon. That was one of the names, one of the most common names that the continent was called. Al-Kubalon. Go look it up and you'll learn some more about it. But I just want to say that because we have been erased on so many levels. Even the continent of Africa has been erased, and how it's been presented. So, but I want to go back to the out of Africa model, which said that humans migrated out of Africa in one big push around 40 to 60,000 years ago, right? That is what we've been taught. That is what we've learned. There's been scientific evidence to say that, and that is what we've been going with. But I want to get really real with it here. I want to also show you guys there's been some updated information from scientists and archaeologists around the world. Now, bless their hearts, these archaeologists and scientists have also had to face incredible backlash for their findings because it challenges the traditional model. And it's upending history, and it's upending how we see ourselves. And when you start having those discussions, it also means that people got to go back and have newer discussions. And most people don't really want to do that because they're comfortable with where they are. But as you can see across the globe here, you can see from this evidence that we have been on this planet for a very, very, very long time. And there's physical evidence now supporting that we were not just in Africa, the continent we know as Africa, but we were outside of the areas, right? So I'm going to go through these really pretty quickly. In the United States in particular, and we can delve into the U.S. on its own, but in San Diego, a team of archaeologists or paleontologists, Thomas Demyr and his team, found scratched up mastodon fossils and large chipped stones at an excavation site near the San Diego Freeway. And his study claims humans reached the Americas 130,000 years ago, based on the fossils that they found and the evidence that they found. Deep, deep, deep stuff, right? Now, there's another archaeologist. She wrote a book in 2022. Her name is Paulette Steeves. She's also indigenous. She argues that the settlement of the Americas may have occurred closer to 100,000 years ago. Okay. So these are, of course, people who've, they've all experienced pushback, and their science has been called pseudo, which is what people often do when they don't really want to acknowledge your existence. Now, in Israel, in the Misliya, I think that's how you say it, Misliya cave in Israel, they found fossils of jaw fragments, and they dated that around 180,000 years ago. 180,000 years ago. Fossils, which indicates they were Homo sapiens, right? So again, that's deep, 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 deep stuff, because if you're talking about finding a whole jawbone, now think about evolution. This particular human, how old were his ancestors? Because it takes a while for us to evolve, correct? Isn't that correct? Or to evolve into different species, which there were several, but that's another topic, right? And in 2023, in Germany, in Lower Saxony, Germany, there's a site where they found footprints that were dated 300,000 years ago. And this is also a site where it included the region's first evidence of elephants. Elephants in Germany? Like, you would never think that, right? But yeah, footprints and animal imprints, right? And in Laos, Tampa Ling Cave in Laos, they found fragments of a human leg bone, right? It's believed to be as much as 86,000 years old in Laos. And they're still doing a lot of excavation in this particular cave, right? So again, physical evidence of us being outside of the continent called Africa beyond the 60,000 years. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that these individuals probably didn't come out of Africa. But the reason why I talk about the debunking is because they say, oh, you came out of Africa, that's it, right? So if that's the case, then either the theory of coming out of Africa has to be pushed earlier in time, or you have to start saying, okay, well, we were all over the place. And as you can see, look at these places. San Diego's way over here. Germany's way over here. Israel, of close to Africa, sure. But then Laos is way over here, all by itself. So what that says to me, again, Aboriginal people have been here for some time. And they've been all over the world. So when I speak specifically of America, that's what I'm talking about, right? So let's dive into the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I know this is always going to be a bit controversial because the story has been pretty well embedded into people's memories and in their consciousness. And I want to first say, look, I'm not debunking the transatlantic slave trade. I'm not saying it didn't happen at all. That's not where I'm coming from. That's not my camp. Although there are people who say that it happened differently, but I'm gonna use numbers. I'm not gonna use my own personal opinion. Now, I want to first take this quote that came from a paper from a gentleman by the name of Jack Forbes, and he writes, quote, "In the British slave colonies of North America, along the Atlantic coast, many persons of American ancestry were at times classified as blacks, Negroes, mulattoes, or people of color. And these terms were, of course, used for people of African ancestry." Yeah, you can read that twice. Many persons of American ancestry were at times classified as blacks, Negroes, mulattoes, or people of color. And those terms were, of course, used for people of African ancestry. Now, there's plenty of evidence to support this and to prove this, not to mention people's personal narratives. So that's why things get a little twisted, because American and African have been synonymous, right? And again, that doesn't mean that people from the continent of Africa haven't been to America and didn't settle in America, didn't build in America. There's a lot of evidence that they have. But for the purposes of acknowledging your American Aboriginal roots, we are very distinctive. Very, very distinctive, right? So, history tells us that the first African slaves were shipped to the British colonies in 1619. Yes, I found evidence that that's true. I did a lot of extensive research on that. But here is in the rub, and this is where it gets a little tricky. Now, one of the beautiful things about what I found here was in this particular publication called The Judicial Cases Concerning American Slavery and the Negro, they actually told you their names, right? Some scholars mention their names, some don't, but more often than not, they don't talk about who these original Africans were. And one of them, a Negro woman, was called Angelo, and they probably meant Angela, but her name was Angela. Others were Anthony and Isabella, whose master was Captain William Tucker of Elizabeth City. So you can read all of this for yourself, but one of the things that I enjoyed was that, okay, now we have names to these original people that came to America. And they, interestingly, were christened as, they were, I should say, baptized as Christians, because that was one of the rules, was that if you brought someone here from other spaces, they had to be baptized before they came to America, which didn't always happen. But anyway, that was the case here. So it was nice to know their names and to know a little bit more about who owned them, which, of course, was interestingly John Rolfe's father-in-law, not Powhatan, but Captain William Pierce, the father of John Rolfe's third wife. But, it's family tree stuff. But in any case, their names were important. So what's interesting is they were called Spanish in this particular publication, Spanish black slaves. And they were probably called Spanish because that's who owned them before they were brought to America. But what's really interesting here is that we often refer to them as slaves. But I want to correct people. When they arrived in Virginia, they were actually considered indentured servants. So when they arrived, there's already a system of indentured servitude already established. So they didn't create a separate category for these individuals. They just integrated them into the existing system. And why that's so significant is because if you were an indentured servant, you actually had a contract. You had a contract to work. And that contract could last 7 years. It could be 10 years. It could be based on your 30th birthday. Like, there were really specific terms in the contract. So the traditional, way that we look at slaves is that, they were slaves for the rest of their lives. But if you want to have a discussion about these particular 20 or so slaves, you have to be incredibly real with it and say that they were indentured. Not saying that that's better necessarily, because in some cases, many cases, it wasn't. But I'm saying that if we're going to stand on that, we have to really tell the whole story. Because, quite frankly, there were a heck of a lot more white indentured servants at that time than there were the Africans. And in the statutes at large, in this particular publication, the African population remained small for most of the century. So it wasn't like they were shipping a whole bunch of Africans at first to America, because they had a heck of a lot more pale-skinned indentured servants working. Of course, it began to swell after 1616. I'll show you those numbers too. So, but from this same book in 1671, there's a quote here. There are 2,000 black slaves, 6,000 Christian servants yearly. We suppose there comes in of servants about 1,500, of which most are English, few Scotch, and few are Irish, and not above 2 or 3 ships of Negroes in 7 years. Now, this is all Virginia, right? And Virginia was the largest slave-holding state in the colony. I'll show you those numbers. But in 1671, as you can see, there weren't that many Africans. And the ones who were coming were not they were in the traditional indentured servant category, if you will. So, and if you're going to call them slaves, then you got to call the white people slaves too, because they were. And there's some books and resources to talk about the white slaves as well. Because sometimes I think we get, these discussions muddled when we talk about the slave versus the indentured servant. And we have to make that distinction, right? Because if you don't, then it seems like you're being a bit disingenuous about it. Now, here is a screenshot of slavevoyages.com where they talk about the transatlantic slave trade and the numbers of quote-unquote African slaves that were brought to America. And as you can see, their data starts from 1645, right? And I took it to 1790 because I was doing some research on the census. So as you can see, every year, you didn't see slaves coming in. They were coming in like every 5 years, 2 years, sometimes back to back. But it was a trickle. It was a very, very, very small trickle of Africans. So, which is going to be relevant and significant in a minute. So again, here's some more numbers based on years. So in total, through 1790, we had almost 120,000 slaves, which is quite significant. So here I'm going by the census every 10 years. So by 1790, we had almost 700,000 slaves in the U.S. And the Africans into the U.S. made up 17% of those. So, of course, I'm like, well, where are the other 500? Who were the other 580,000 slaves that they were counting? Because in some cases, and I did research on this, but not a deep, deep dive, but in some cases, they weren't counting the white or pale-skinned slaves as slaves. They were counting them as just regular people. And remember, keep in mind something, you guys. The American Indian Wars started in 1609 and went through 1890. So you have a lot of prisoners of war to consider, too, when you think about these numbers. And I know people are going to say, well, you had natural population growth. But I'm going to dispute that, too, in a minute. But in any case, I wanted you guys to be aware of that. So, of course, by 1800, you have a slave population that keeps growing. They're still shipping in a lot of Africans, half as many as they shipped in 1790, right? I don't know why. I'm going to do research on that, too. By 1810, that number had shot up almost double. Now, keep in mind something. In 1808, Congress had passed a law making it illegal for Americans to engage in the slave trade with the other nations. They're just like, we're done. We're done with this. And by 1820 and 1830, the level of Africans that were shipped to the North America was almost nothing compared to what it was before. Again, remember, the Indian Wars are still going on. The Indians and Aboriginals are still fighting for their land. They're still fighting for dominance, trying to keep and hold on to what they've got. So in the end, we've got almost 4 million slaves in the U.S. Almost 4 million slaves in the U.S., with about 252,000 being Africans. Now, I want to talk about something, this infant mortality rate analysis, because it's hard to do the math on this stuff because the math is all over the place and the estimates are all over the place, no matter who you speak to or what publication you read. But the growth in population rate was deeply, deeply affected, right? Now, historical demographers estimate that in 1850, enslaved infants died before 1 year of age at a rate of 1.6 times higher than that of white infants. 1.6 times higher. That's even before they're still babies. And in terms of enslaved infant deaths, you had 340 to 217 white infant deaths per 1,000 live births. So out of 1,000 births, 340 of those infants didn't make it. Just didn't make it, right? And in the South, in general, an estimated 50% of enslaved infants were stillborn or died within the first year of life. Okay? So when people talk about population growth, I'm like, okay. Are all of those people that were enslaved Africans? Just putting it out there. Now, in addition to that, as a result of this high infant and childhood death rate, the average life expectancy of a slave at birth was just 21 or 22 years, compared to 40 to 43 years for antebellum whites. So again, even if you made it out of childhood, you still didn't really make it to old age as a slave. Didn't make it. And our infant mortality rate in the U.S. is still high. I mean, it's nothing like it was in the antebellum South, but our mortality rate, our infant mortality rate, is still high compared to other people. Still high. Look at that. Almost double. It's just insane. Still, right? So, but with all that being said, people will still talk about population growth and talk about, well, those 252,000 Africans could have produced 4 million people. Well, sure, maybe. But I need to see the math based on this very, very complex dynamic of infant mortality in adult mortality. Now in 2020 census, you see the American Indian is 9.7 million, right? And the African American is 47 million. Now, of that 47 million, 2% of the 47 million are Jamaicans and Haitians. So, with all of that being said, you got high infant mortality rate, you've got wars going on, and still we outnumber the traditional, or what we would call the Native American. Just look at the math, because it doesn't add up, right? So I, of course, say, well, of those people that were slaves, those had to be Aboriginal people. It wasn't just the African, right? Now, when we look at maps today, African Americans, Black, people, that's how they like to categorize us, we're all over the United States. There isn't really a spot in the U.S. where we are not. We're everywhere, right? Of course, the majority of us live in the South. That is traditional. That should not be a surprise for anybody, right? Now, when it comes to the Caribbean, when you talk about Jamaicans and people from Haiti and Trinidad and the Virgin Islands, this is where they tend to live, typically in the Northeast and some in the West, and spotted all over in the Midwest, right? Same thing for people who are of African descent. Nigerians, Ghanaians, South Africans, Somalians, Ethiopians, they're all over too. I just wanted to show those maps to kind of show you where we are, right, as melanated people. So here are my final thoughts. And I just want to say this because, again, you guys are on your journey and you got to do your research yourself. And we have to start talking about this because there's a whole political dynamic at play here that we haven't thought about. Again, I want to say we don't all look alike. For those who are saying, well, you're co-opting my culture, you're trying to appropriate. It's like, nah, I can't appropriate anything. I'm the descendant of the original people. I just want to clarify that again and say that. I'm going to keep saying that. So, but here we are. We have various tribes that clearly are Aboriginal. The Atacapa, you notice them more in Louisiana. Of course, Seminole, you've probably seen this picture of Diana Fletcher, beautiful woman. Chata elder here, beautiful. And then, of course, you have this Cherokee woman. And this is from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I found this in a book. Beautiful. And my third great-grandmother is Cherokee. Then you have another elder, George Bonga, Chippewa. Of course, the Seminole. You have the Seminole. You have Chief Whitehorse. His picture was taken. He was in Paris. You have some more Seminoles in Florida. Beautiful family. The Comanche. You've probably seen this photo as well. The Creeks. Now, this is probably one of the most interesting photos because they're all different colors. But they all are Creeks, right? Now, this gentleman here, he's unidentified. They don't know who he is. Probably someone does, but I couldn't immediately find out who he was. But these two gentlemen, all these two here, and this gentleman here, they all are Creeks. History together, I'm pretty sure. Now, of course, people say he has African ancestry. Yeah, he does. He does. But they're all Creeks. And this particular man in particular could speak Creek, the language. These two here were negotiators, right? which meant that they had to be able to speak the quote unquote white man's language, English, and speak in their language. Just putting that out there, just letting that sit for a minute. So all in all, why is the establishment still labeling you African American when the African brought to the U.S. was in the minority? Right? Well, I'm going to tell you why. Because they want to manipulate you into thinking that you have no bona fide land rights or Aboriginal title. Because if you keep displacing me and telling me that I'm over there, that means I'm an immigrant. Okay? So, of course, we know that America is the land of immigrants, the great experiment. So, the more I identify with being an immigrant, the less Aboriginal title that I have. Now, that's not to say, again, we are all mixed up. We have so much going on in our blood, right? But if I'm walking down the street as a brown-skinned, dark-skinned woman, why do I say that I'm an immigrant? I'm not an immigrant. I'm Aboriginal to this planet, to this place, right? And the more you don't know your heritage, this makes taking your land, civil rights, birthrights, and everything that much easier. That much easier. And you can't have that in this climate. You just can't. You have to be embracing all of yourself. Because you want to notice something about the U.S. Census, is that when you look at the U.S. Census, when it comes to the quote-unquote white person, they're not hyphenated, right? They're not leading with the hyphenated term, I should say. Yes, many are from Germany. They're from Ireland. They're from England, Poland. They're from so many different places in Europe. But they're leading with white. They're leading with American. And that's what we should be doing, is we should be leading with American because we are the original peoples. When you say the African, you are of African descent, but for how long has it been? Right? How long has it been? What I'm saying is that you're probably more American, Aboriginal, than you are African. Because of course the question becomes, where did the African go when he came here? It's clear he was absorbed by the tribes. He lived with the tribes. He spoke the language, and his children and their children spoke the language. So at what point did he retain his Africanness? In some cases, it's lost. So that means that the Aboriginal dominates. But I want you guys to really, really think about that, because, again, when you do not embrace your Aboriginal side, you are displacing yourself. You are saying that, oh, I am the descendant of an immigrant, i.e. an indentured servant, then a slave. Because unfortunately, they tended to mix slave with African. And that wasn't necessarily true. Because there were, like I said earlier, there are a lot of white slaves in this country. So to use the term slave is disingenuous, and it's actually not cool, because there are a lot of quote unquote slaves in this country. So again, go and read the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and start embracing your Aboriginal side, because you are Aboriginal to this planet, and start doing a deep dive into your genealogy, because that is going to tell you more than anything, more than any book, more than any professor, more than any scholar, and even myself, to tell you who you are. Because we have to start embracing our Aboriginal roots. It's time. It's time that we start walking and talking that, and stop letting people say, oh, we are misappropriating. We're not misappropriating anything. So I leave you with this. Again, there are going to be tons of resources that you can look through. They are in the description of this video. And I'm so glad that you guys spent some time and sat here and listened to me today. There will be more follow-up videos about this subject. more to talk about. And please, please, please like, share, and subscribe this video, and even look at our other videos. We do extensive research on things, and yeah, had so much fun doing this one. I will be talking to you guys soon.